In this video, I'd like to talk about pivot tables. Pivot tables are essentially tools inside of Excel which allows us to easily summarize large amounts of data. And in particular, it allows us to do this in an interactive way, so we can actually explore different ways of showing our data. So what are some of the features? Well, like I said, it's very good at summarizing large amounts of data. I've had, in particular, very large data sets in the several thousands, 50,000, 100,000 rows or even more, and several hundreds or even thousands of columns. And if it were not for pivot tables, I would have had to look at other features like perhaps Microsoft Access or some other computing language to summarize this data. But it is a very nice tool, and it's very powerful. So it does allow us to use some built-in functionalities, simple count, sums, average. We can also build our custom formulas, and we can basically control the data that we see. So we can expand, collapse data, and we can filter and sort and do all those types of things that we can do with just a normal table. So let's talk about the task a little bit. For this learning activity, we have a data set that represents enrollment figures for various colleges in Canada. So we would like to build a pivot table to summarize this data so it's more easily understood. And of course, that's a little bit vague, albeit, but I think you'll see through the activity that the process of generating these pivot charts is more or less trial and error, and more or less dependent upon what you think is actually a better way to format the data. So I'll explore several of those options. So let's go ahead and begin by opening up the file. Okay, when we open up the file, we do see in the Enrollment tab, we have a number of registered students, the institution abbreviation, the institution name, so for example, University of British Columbia, Vancouver, abbreviated to UBCV. What they have done is essentially broken down various categories. So for example, this particular course is actually broken down into several steps where they list the number of students that meet certain conditions. For example, all of these are undergraduate students. It's a bachelor program in the year 2000. And then they broke down several categories in terms of males and females and whether they are international students or not. So it appears that in this first row of data, we do have non-international students who are females in 2002 taking this one class, and there's 2 of those particular students. So you'll see several rows of this information that are used to explain the total enrollment, and we're going to use a pivot table to summarize that data a little bit better. So I'm going to continue to scroll to the right a little bit and just try to understand what's being presented in the data set here. Again, we have male, female, gender column. We have whether they're full or part-time status, the name of the course, and maybe an aggregate name that they use, so a full name, and a subject area. So there's various subject areas. The data set is actually fairly large. I'm going to go to the bottom of the page. There are 44,854 records in this data set. And again, there are various colleges. If you want to explore this data set a little bit, there's various colleges listed here and things like that. So anyway, to manually try to build a quote-unquote table or some formulas that summarize this data could be very difficult. Pivot tables give us a way that we can summarize this quickly. So let's start talking about the pivot table. If you want to insert a pivot table, go to Insert, and then Pivot Table is here on the left. Let's go ahead and hit OK. It's going to suggest a range for us. This range is fine. We do have an option here to place this pivot table on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I want to create a new one. And when we hit OK there, we have this general layout of the pivot table. So it by default says Sheet 1. I want to call this perhaps Enrollment Pivot. Okay. Whenever we click off of this sort of template, which we'll explore here in a little bit, we no longer see the options to fill the template with. But if we simply click on this in this range over here on the left, we can actually see the pivot table field list. So once you access this, you'll have the pivot table tools up here in the options. We can control anything we see with these show buttons. So if we didn't want to see the field list, we can take that off. It'll not be highlighted again. If we didn't want the add and subtract buttons, which will come into play later, we can do that, or the headers and whatnot. So later, this might come into more to play. There's certain options that we'll explore, but we won't actually explore all of these. Some other video will explore some of these features in more detail. But in general, we can change the reference to our data. Right now, it's selected on the enrollment and the entire table. Perhaps we update this data set, and based on its property, right now it's just a range of data. So we might have to later go back and say, hey, I need to change that source. Or maybe we actually change some of the values in what's already existing. Sometimes we'll have to hit the refresh button to allow the pivot table to know that the data has changed perhaps. So this is a very useful button. Slicers will be covered elsewhere. The pivot table does have a name. If you do reference the pivot table with a formula, the reference will be pivot table 1. We can certainly change that. We have various design elements. Before I show you this, let's start entering data. This is more about the style, the colors, things like that we're pretty used to. We can control different banding and rows and subtotals and grand totals and different report layouts and how to show blank rows. So do you want to actually show blanks, or do you want to remove the blanks? So we'll get into that in just a little bit. So what I'm going to recommend is that you just simply either watch the video or follow along with exactly the steps I do. But again, this is a process that is usually user specific. So I usually try to think about how I might want the data summarized, and through the process of this trial and error process, I usually end up creating a different table altogether which summarizes the data better than what I had imagined. So I think you'll understand what I mean when you start exploring with this by yourself. Okay, so here are the different lists. These are simply the headers of our data set. We have the number of registered students that meet a certain condition, and we have all the other headers that we talked about. So year, institution name, the program name, the subject area, and so forth. We have 4 areas down here in the pivot table option. We have a report filter, row labels, column labels, and values. So the 2 important ones off the bat would be the row and the column. So this is essentially asking you, how do you want to display your data? Do you want to break up perhaps colleges across columns at the top, or do you want to break up the colleges perhaps along the rows? So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to use the institution name and go ahead and place that here. So if we place this here, the row labels are going to start to build our table for us. So again, if you wanted to display it across a row to start out with, that's fine. You might want to explore with it across the column headings. If you ever need to move it, you just simply drag these back and forth. If you ever need to remove a certain field from one of these lists, you can actually just drag it outside, and that icon will change to an X. So it'll actually get rid of the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and select institution name again. You can either sort of drag and drop these down to the fields that you want, or you can simply check mark it and it's going to guess where you might want it. So here it's going to put it in the row, and actually that's how I want to build my table to start out with. So again, I clicked off of the pivot table, so it's not going to give me those options. Once I click back on, it's going to give me those options just fine. Okay, so now maybe we want to separate this data in terms of undergraduates and graduate students. So we actually do have this option here, student level. I'm going to grab and drag and drop this to the column label. So now we have the column labels showing here along with the grand total. Now the value you were seeing here is apprenticeship. And depending on why you're wanting to summarize this data, maybe you don't want this listed in your table at all. What we can actually do is go to the column label. The first one that we add, we can control what we see there. So if you hit this arrow here, we have our sorting options, our label filter, our value filters, and then actually the names here. So I'm actually going to deselect all and just select graduate and undergraduate. And once we hit OK, now we're only going to see the graduate undergraduate that we desired. And it could be that you might want to sort this data and show undergraduate first, so we could actually sort in the opposite direction, Z to A. So we have undergraduates, then graduate. Okay, so these are just ideas, of course. You may want to do this entirely different, which is fine. So what are other things in our data set that we might want to analyze? Well, we definitely want to investigate how many registered students we have, provided that they're in one of these columns or the other. So let's go ahead and drag the registered students down to values. So these are the values that are going to appear in your table. So right now we have a grand total of, let's say, looks like 23,284 students at the Royal Roads University. And our table is split up between undergraduate and graduate. Again, if we wanted to remove the student level altogether and maybe leave the registered student there, we can certainly do that by simply just dragging student level off and out of the pivot table field list. So here we go, just some of the students. So this is taking all that information in the enrollment data and summarizing that for us here. Okay, we can simply put student level back on, and those values are going to be separated, and a grand total is shown. Now, what you might want to do, maybe you don't want this grand total. What we can do is go to Design and control whether we're seeing grand totals or not. So I'm going to turn it off for rows. We actually have two. We have the grand total at the bottom here, and then we have the grand total along the column. So I'm going to turn that off, and it's going to turn both of those off there. So now we're in the mode of thinking about different ways in which we might want to summarize this data, depending on your application, of course. Perhaps it's not very useful just to have a sum of the number of students registered in these institutions. Maybe it would be a better idea to give us some control about filtering the maybe gender. Okay, so we can throw gender into the registered filter, and maybe we just want to see all females. So it does look like we have a few categories, other and other slash. So maybe I just want to see females. We can check this, select multiple items, and that'll give us control of selecting which ones we actually want. So I'm going to just filter by females. Notice these values in the pivot table back here will change automatically. For example, we're at 17,737. Once I hit OK, we're down to 9,000. Okay, so it'll show you the filter that we're using. We're using just females in this list. So now we've added one field to each one of these categories here, these lists. Okay, so what might else be important? Well, maybe year. So where should we put year? Okay, well, let's just play around with it like I'm suggesting as a trial and error process. I could definitely put it in report filter, and I could say, well, I just want to look at the 2012 data. So the quickest way to do that is hit all and then 2012, okay. So these are all the females registered in these colleges in 2012. Okay. Let me go ahead and change the position of where year is. So we can actually drag year down to the row, and I'm going to actually change this filter just so it's a little bit easier to see what this year is doing. So I'm going to drag it up here for just a second and change 2012 back to showing all. Okay, so this is all, and then drag down the year. So now we're seeing the table sort of come to life. We have the institution name and then the specific year. So it's broken down all of these totals, by year, undergraduate versus graduate. We could flip-flop the order. Maybe it makes more sense to put year on top, because some years the university just didn't have any, let's say, females at this college, or no students, or we didn't have the data set for it, or what have you. So I think this looks okay. Maybe it would be better to put the year over in the column. Okay, so what do we have here? We have our undergraduates from 2002 to 2012 and those counts. And then we have our graduates. So it is showing a total here. So maybe we want to get rid of that total. Let's see, do not show subtotals. Then we have all of our graduates. I think that looks okay. A lot of times you'll see blanks, like right here we're seeing undergraduates blank for University of British Columbia Great Northern Way, and it's only because we happen to have 13 students in 2011 and 2012 respectively, so it had to add that extra line in the data, so you're seeing the blanks here. Okay. So again, maybe it makes more sense to put year on top of student level. I think this is less organized. It's a little harder to read, but it does break down the data in order of how you stack these fields. So I think this looks fairly good. We can quickly tell how many students that were undergraduate or graduate in that particular college. Okay, so what else might be important? Maybe you're an administrator at one of these universities and you want to know how many students are in a particular subject area. Okay, so what we can do is go to subject area and think of ways we want to display it. Should it be a filter? Well, we could filter these potential categories here. If we only wanted to see, let's say, engineering students, we could select multiple and only select engineering. So that'll be a filter option. Keeping the filter option where it is at engineering, we could drag the subject area to institution. So these are just the engineering firms under the representative college. Of course, we can take that filter off. Sometimes once you get multiple rows on, it's very difficult to control whether you're seeing that or not. So sometimes what I do is just either remove it altogether or put it back up here in the report filter and change that back to all. Okay, so I'm going to change engineering technology back to all. Okay, so when I drag the subject down, now indented under each of these college names are my individual programs which are applicable, and showing off the counts for both undergraduate and graduate. We can certainly add more filters, so maybe we're more interested in females who are perhaps international students. We can drag the international field down here, and control if they are or not an international student. We can also perhaps look at student status as a filter. We can put that simply here and say, well, I want full-time students. How many full-time female international students do we have? So here's a quick way to summarize the data from the 40 or so thousand records that we have in a way that is very easy to understand. So how many students meet this condition of female? Yes, you're an international and you're a full-time student. Well, here you go. Here are all the names. We can certainly add back those subtotals, perhaps at the right of each category, like what is displaying here is gray. So that might be an option you want to leave. We can show at the, let's see, at the tops. So what you're seeing here is these counts here at the top of the row category. Okay, let's see. I'm going to take this off to get it back to where we were, and you can see that those totals are no longer there. And of course, you know, there's several different ways we can summarize this. Maybe you can find a better way to represent this, and the process really boils down to trial and error. It might make more sense to say subject area and institution on bottom. So if you're talking about specific engineering programs, for example, it limits the search to only those schools that actually offer those programs. So that might not be a bad idea either. But I'm going to leave it as institution and subject area. And I just want to comment on one more thing. In pivot tables, by default, it's either a sum, which I did want the sum of the number registered. We can change that if we click on this arrow and go to field settings. If I just wanted a count, I could have a count there. So it's only going to do a count of how many times those conditions are met. We could change that to perhaps an average, a min, a max. There's some other formulas here: products, counts, standard deviation, variance. We can format the numbers. I'm going to leave this on a sum. I could format the numbers as perhaps maybe a number with a separator of 1,000 and show no decimal places. Maybe that'll be nice. So let's hit sum and OK. So let's see, do we have any bigger programs? Well, we could see that number if we did take off all the filters. So I'm going to put everything back on to all, so we're not going to filter out anything. So we can see that number style is showed here, so that's pretty nice. We can also, maybe we want multiple statistics on just the number of registered. So what we could do is actually drag this down again, and maybe instead of a sum, and this is just an example that I'll take off later, maybe we want a count. So now the data gets a little bit harder to read, but now we do have that count and the sum together. So I'm going to take this off. I just wanted to show you that you can actually place many items here, and depending on how many column labels you have, it's a little bit easier or more difficult to understand. So let me just briefly review what we have. We started out with a pretty large data set. We moved into the pivot table. We explored different ways of actually representing our data. We explored in a trial and error fashion where some of these might make more sense. We then explored ways of filtering, and what I suggested is perhaps a female student, which is an international student, and perhaps only full-time. So there you have it. Again, you can explore with many different ways interactively, which is very useful to summarize larger data sets.